Sounds great. Dan, where are you at today?
I am in New York at the Twin Data office.
Awesome. That's where we first met. I'm
Yeah.
out in Salt Lake City. The Twing Data office.
Yeah,
It
the
so,
co-working space basically.
sounds legit.
Oh, there's a whiteboard and everything. That's how you know I'm serious.
Serious work on that whiteboard too. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I
I'm
arranged
usually
it all for
I'm used to
company.
seeing whiteboards with like 10 years of historical data just like half erased and just permanently like etched on there.
No, all the company secrets are on here, so that's why I had to erase them right before our grand strategy.
Perfect. So we can do a couple brief intros, I guess, and get going here.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Saf. I've met Dan in New York last year when we were working on data things. We're still working on data things. I previously led a data team at a big data healthcare company in Boston, doing large scale analytics on hundreds of millions of patient records. And these days I have been working on Arrow. We are basically automating data engineering and growth analytics for teams. Uh, Previously also built up getarrow.dev, which is a automated Snowflake cost optimization native application on the marketplace.
Cool. Yeah, now I'm Dan. I am the CEO and founder of Twin Data. And that's how I met Saf. We initially started doing this cost performance optimization for data warehouses by analyzing queries and then using that to improve data models. Before this, I spent a variety of data roles, ranged from data science to data engineering to leading an engineering team at an ad tech company, which is how I got exposed to these massive scales of data. We're doing about 300 billion auctions a day and running massive Spark jobs, Snowflake jobs, trying to make sense of all that data. So I've always liked it, whether for good or for worse, and excited to chat more and dig into it.
For sure. So much to dig into on data these days. We kind of picked a couple of topics that have been hot recently on LinkedIn and the data zeitgeist. So first is digging into practical examples of CTEs and subqueries. This debate originally came up, at least on my feed, from Toby, who works at Tobico Data, of like SQL Mesh, SQL Glot. He as Zach said, he woke up and chose violence that day and said he preferred subqueries to CTs, and I couldn't tolerate it. So anyway, I think Dan also expressed kind of a preference for subqueries in certain cases, and LinkedIn. I was like, let's talk about it, have a friendly debate. Second topic is around the best way to organize data teams, namely embedded versus platform, loosely speaking. And full disclosure, like black and white takes as we present them. They're popular and they're hot takes and whatnot, but in practice, obviously the tool that we use or the strategy we use is context dependent and shouldn't trust anyone, much less us two here necessarily, who deal in absolutes. So we'll try to add some nuance as we go along. As far as logistics, questions and comments are definitely welcome. So if you're on LinkedIn, drop them in the event chat. And if you're on Zoom, drop them in the Zoom chat. If you want to engage like a little bit more low latency, probably recommend joining the Zoom, but I don't see either way is okay. Dan, did I miss anything?
No, that was it. And I'll post a link to the Zoom right now into the LinkedIn chat in case people want to join. And
Awesome.
now we're off to the races.
Cool.
Cool. So I guess it's my turn, right? Yeah. I'll key off the first topic. So first topic, CTEs versus subqueries. So CTE stands for common table expressions. I looked it up right before just to confirm. And high level, right, they're a way, and like before we dig into it, at least for this one, Sav's going to screen share some examples, and we put together, like a dummy schema, dummy data set, just because we think it's not as interesting or valuable to talk about these higher level abstractions, and it's a lot more useful to look at actual examples. We're also hoping people could react to it, right, to generally get a sense of what we're talking about and why we're saying that, and like what you'll notice is, as Saf mentioned, like neither of us are, absolutist here. Like at the end of the day, we'll pick whatever makes sense, and everyone really should pick whatever makes sense for them. These are really two different ways of getting at the same thing, right? Fundamentally, it's like you can get the same exact results. It's more of a question of like, when do you use one versus the other? So if you look at the first example to the left, a CTE starts with a with statement and it's defining, in essence, a table, like this customer subset that has that query definition, that select customer ID, and then you are able to reference that table customer subset in, in the either another CTE further down, or in the overall query. Subqueries don't really work that way. In that case, you're basically inlining the SQL, right? So in this case, it's the same exact table definition as the select customer ID, but it's included in a query itself.
Exactly. So Dan, what do you like about this as you look at this solution versus this? And by the way, these are kind of some basic questions that we rigged up. In this case, what is the average order value for each customer? Only including those who have placed more than 3
Yeah, and
orders.
there's a
So
schema here. Let me send a link to this as well, in the bottom of the chat here. So people get a feel for the schema, but it's generally intuitive, right? It's like customers, orders, order items. It's like a very standard example generated by ChatGPT. So everyone should be pretty familiar with what this is talking about.
yeah.
So what, sorry, you asked what I liked about the subquery angle.
Yeah.
No, I think this is probably a function of age, right? When you learn to code, but subqueries existed before CTEs, and I grew up writing subqueries, sometimes, 300, 400, 500 line queries. And I generally, in my mind, they're a little easier to read, more intuitive is because the data ends up, or the logic ends up being much more localized. So in this case, if you see the select customer ID from orders, group by, I could select that, highlight it, execute it in a, typically I use data grip as my code editor. So I could do, command enter to run the query and the results show up right away. And then I build outwards when I develop, when I write queries. And as I do it over and over and over again, I end up sort of expanding the highlight area, being able to incrementally run the query to confirm that I get the results as I get along. Like I just don't really get that same benefit when I'm using CTEs, right? In the case, like, I mean, this is obviously a trivial example and it's both pretty simple, but as the queries get more and more complicated, I can just like the sort of, it feels more interactive for me to write subqueries that I could sort of build outwards from like a very core sort of center rather than trying sort of to keep everything in my mind at once. I don't know if that was clear, but
Yeah. Yeah, the reason I prefer the CTEs is, first of all, I think it pattern matches better with the way I program in other languages. And different people program in different languages, and even when they program in those languages, they do it differently. But like in Python, I might do like A equals 1, B equals A plus 1, right? So here I have like a declaration of like some data that I'm interested in manipulating later. And a CT for me is a declaration of a data set that I want to be using later. So it feels similar to me. And then I kind of go down and then I manipulate that data set. I reference it here in customer subset, right? Now I think the counter argument, I think this is what Toby was saying in his original post and what you were kind of mentioning, is that when I'm kind of like looking at this query at face value, in order to understand what it's doing, I kind of go to, oh, I see this customer subset thing. Then I got to like flip up and my eyeballs got to go up to the top of the query and be like, okay, what does customer subset actually mean? And that's kind of similar to, I'm not saying that's like a globally optimal thing, but it's just something, a workflow I'm used to, because if I'm looking at like an imperative programming language like Python or C, I see a variable or a function call, and then I need to like go to the function definition. And yes, it can definitely get cumbersome, but it's like a workflow I'm used to.
well, like for me, let me actually like jump to your code and I'll explain part of what maybe like a more real live example. So I'm gonna live edit your code, right? Like you can
Yeah.
imagine you got another one where it was blah 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 and it was like, select something from customer subset, right? This query above. Right, so
Yeah.
you're referencing this CTE here, this customer subset in this DAS app, whatever query. Like for me, this is kind of hard to debug because if I actually want to validate that this looks as expected, I would then have to type in another one. I would have to do something like this, right? In order to like confirm that it's working as expected.
Mm-hmm.
Versus if I didn't have this logic and in here, right, from orders, whatever, I'm gonna do like another join.
Yeah.
Right, in this case, I could just do this, like, I could highlight either that initial select, right, like line, basically like inside the join, like because I guess you don't see my cursor, but the thing I put the star in front of.
Yeah.
And or I could then work my way up and then I could like go from here down to here and highlight that and execute that. Or then I could build my
Got
way up. So I think from like a coding standpoint, it's a lot easier because I'm not necessarily writing these like arbitrary select statements in the middle of my mental process, right? Instead, I'm only writing the code that's going to result in or like result in the actual query or the data I'm interested in at the end of the day.
That is interesting. Like I actually find debugging so much easier in CTs. And this totally might end up being like this personal preference
Yeah.
thing. So like if I end up with let's say, you know, what you were saying earlier, I have like multiple CTEs here.
Yeah.
Let's say I have just like customer subset 2, right? And if I yeah, usually like this kind of data dumpster diving involves like going up the chain and like figuring out whether those
Yeah, like
intermediates
how
look
would you
good.
test right now that customer subset 2 has the data you want? You
Yeah,
would have
this
to
is
select from it.
all my SQL worksheets end up looking like this. And you tell me if this is looks like total crap, but I end up with like a bunch of maybe commented out, right?
Yeah.
I end up with like a lot of these basically for the intermediates as like, you know, leftovers from when I was debugging those. So that tells you kind of like the workflow I went through. And it is
Got it.
extra typing. It sounds like
Yeah.
what you do is kind of you go to the intermediate and you just like use a keyboard shortcut or like an execute function.
Yeah, I'll like highlight it and do like command, I don't know, enter to execute that part. Or I'll just copy and paste it into, my editor near the bottom and tweak it and then copy and paste it back into the like subquery. So I
Yeah.
think that you're right. I think it's just like maybe like goes back to workflow. And like for what it's worth, I know I'm taking the subquery side and I know it's a losing position. Almost everyone's like, Dan, you're crazy. Like CTEs are the best. And like for what it's worth, I have been using CTEs a lot more, but I find them to be my second order. Like by default, I'll do a subquery. And then when I get frustrated, and then I'll say, actually CTE is better here. Like especially if I want to reuse it in multiple places, that to me is probably the biggest benefit of CTEs. Like if I have, some complex logic around, let's say customers we care about, it's very annoying, right, to keep pasting that as a subquery over and over and over again in different other, in other blocks versus
Mhm.
reference that single, CTE, that single table that you've defined, like makes things a lot simpler. Like I get that, but it's just not my default. Like I'll do it
Yeah.
when I have to do it, not, not sort of like naturally.
Yeah. I also think CTs are, you know, against my own position here are more prone to abuse, and I'll mention why in a second, but maybe it would be helpful to go
Yeah.
to a more extreme example or a more complicated example where we have like two data sets. We already kind of like started doing this above, but here we have like more, I guess you would say nesting um,
Yeah. I mean,
in
I
the
think
subqueries.
for full caveat, like
And
these queries could also be simplified, so don't call us out on
they
it.
could be, yeah. So basically, if I guess these are two patterns we're talking about, right? And
Yep.
so when we have more data sets we're manipulating, how do the patterns actually look in kind of more extreme cases? In the CTE case, you end up with like more of these blocks of code, right? And you can imagine like, oh, if there's 10 different data sets up front, maybe you end up with 10 CTEs in that case. And in the subquery case, to me, the way that pattern proliferates is by nesting. So you end up with like indentations. When I look at like a highly indented piece of code, that's just like very hard for me to read personally. Like visually, I just like seeing all the select statements and data sets like in one kind of at one indentation level. I
Really?
don't know if that's
I
personal.
like the
You tell me.
nesting. The
You do?
nesting
Okay.
gives me this like natural, like, I don't know, parent-child relation. Like maybe think of like a Python code, right? It's kind of nice with the indenting that you see what's being inside another block versus
Yeah.
if you have five different functions, then you internally have to like figure out like the calling mechanism, right? Which function calls which function, which calls which function.
Yeah, that feels like a functional programming versus like imperative or procedural difference to me. So I can definitely see that being subjective. Like if I had to distill and this isn't like a subquery thing necessarily. It's probably more of a nesting argument that I'm making, and subqueries happen to like invite nesting.
For sure.
But when you're doing nesting, my issue is like when I'm looking at these. So here you have three levels of nesting, right?
Yep.
You have this outer select, another select, and then finally this third level of nesting. This inner one is self-contained. So I like fully understand what that data set looks like. But the one above that, I have to look above and below that because like this is sandwiched in between. And that's kind of like a SQL intricacy because like the group bys and having and maybe like a where clause would be like after the data set that it's referencing. And so I'm having to like look up and down to kind of like as I go upward the levels of nesting to understand what's happening. Whereas like in the CTE world, everything's kind of like self-contained. I'm like, this data set looks like this data set looks like this. And then finally, the thing that references those looks like this.
I don't know. I think so for smaller queries, you're right. Like for smaller queries, it probably doesn't really matter too much. It's just in practice, you end up with these like super complex beasts. And then it's like, do you trust the subquery and how much do you care versus like refactoring? Because like at the end of the day, they do end up being the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Right. When you run the query, like I'm sure I'm sure a smart query planner will actually execute them the same exact way. Like sometimes they don't, but maybe so you do end up with some performance differences. But I do think maybe it really does go back to style. It's not like a real argument of one is
Totally.
the other.
Totally. One thing that's nice about subqueries is that it imposes a constraint on you. So like you can only reference this like the innermost thing with the thing from the thing immediately above it, I think. But like in C, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say like the anti-pattern for subqueries, like which bothers me a lot, is like oftentimes you start with a very simple query and then it gets more and more complicated over time. And like an example would be in this case, right? Let's say you have a lot of some pretty complicated logic, a lot of like left joins, and then you suddenly say, hey, oh shoot, I want to apply the same filtering logic to each of my tables that's being joined. That's a lot easier to do as a CTE, right? I'll grant you that, because then I'm not copying the 6th line, this like select order ID from orders and copying and pasting it into like 7 different clauses, like other subqueries. Because like that is for sure is like a like a code smell, right? The fact that you're duplicating it. I think it's the same thing as when you think about writing general software, DRY, right? Like don't repeat yourself. So if you find yourself repeating the same thing over and over and over again, like maybe that's a good argument to say, hey, refactor into a CTE.
Yeah. I think we both agree that like a ton of CTEs is probably bad and a ton of like nested subqueries is probably bad. Like what is your line, would you say, when you're personally writing SQL, when you turn something into like a separate, maybe a temp table or a table?
I don't know. It depends on like, is it application code? Is it like temporary like development code? How often am I going to run it? Like, I know I think if the query evolves over time, I'm not as prone to having a real limit so long as it executes quickly. The problem happens if I go back and then I'm like, oh shoot, I need to modify and tweak it. And then I'm like, oh hell, what was I thinking when I wrote this? Like that's I think what I use as an opportunity to refactor. And when I do refactor, I think I do go CT first because it's just easier for me to like reason through it. Even if while I'm writing it, it's more maybe like a subquery first approach. Like I don't have that much trouble, I think, keeping like pretty massive queries like in my head. Especially I think with the CT style because they do end up being like flatter and like simpler to reason through.
Yeah. One thing I would suggest, no matter whether you're using CTEs or subqueries, like maybe the difference isn't necessarily as much the patterns or like it's in how well you implement your specific choice. So making sure you have good names. So like customer subset 2 maybe isn't the best thing, right? Like maybe this should be more specific. And similarly, when you alias your subqueries, like be clear about what this data set actually contains, right? So orders, like I actually prefer being explicit, like orders with more than 5 items. Like I actually prefer more verbose things. I don't know if you have an opinion. Yeah.
I do the opposite because I don't like typing it. Like I don't like that. It's like I would call this.
This is more for production code.
Like dot something.
Yeah. Just for the sake of like someone new looking at this code, it doesn't need to be unnecessarily verbose, but just something kind of clear and explicit so that people know what's going on. Cool. Well, I'm sure we didn't like resolve this debate once and for all, but I think key things here are it really depends on kind of how you implement them specifically. And then in either way, you can definitely abuse them, and using too many subqueries or too many CTs or the same kind of code smell really in the end.
Yeah, the other thing Saf and I mentioned, like as we were preparing for this, is performance does matter surprisingly, right? So I think when you're doing like a one-time query, whatever, you use whatever makes sense, and but if performance does matter, write both. Like you'll find it pretty surprising that one might end up being a lot faster than the other, and it's not universally true whether it's going to be a CT or a subquery. like it varies like on the specific query, maybe like the stats that the database has and whatever else. And I think Saf's point also is like if you do care about performance, there might be completely other approaches like temp tables, and now views, something else that may just end up solving your problem entirely.
Totally. Awesome. You want to
Yeah,
jump in?
like as I were
Jump in.
talking, I'm like I know there's this like Excel championship that they have, right? Where
Uh,
like they'll give people the same data set and have them like do Excel calculations. There should be a SQL championship. Like give like 100 people the same, I don't know, data set, the same
yeah.
schema, and
Yeah.
then have them all compete and like have some sort of playoff of like who could write the fastest, most efficient query.
Totally. Yeah.
Do it with
Get to the right answer fastest. Yeah.
it could be
Totally.
sponsored by Era.
Yeah.
Era.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe that's something we should build out. Sure. You want to jump into the second debate? Best ways to
Yeah, yeah.
organize? Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, the second topic, I mean, you want to stop sharing screen?
Yeah.
Focus. Yeah, the second yeah, topic we put together is less, diving into the code and instead more about, what is the best way to organize data teams. So, high level, like two extremes. One is the embedded model where you have a data analyst, data engineer, part of an actual, whether it's a product team or a commercial team such as marketing or finance. And then the other model is a platform team, right? Where you have a dedicated team of data engineers, like data analysts, that know their system, in and out, and then they're taking work from others, like from other teams, and they're in essence sort of like prioritizing that internally. Was that a
Yeah.
good intro, Sam?
Yeah, good summary. And then I think colloquially we're talking about the first model as like the embedded model where you're embedding data folks in kind of the final like business teams. And Dan's sort of taking that side. And then I'm taking the side of the kind of platform or centralized team, where it's exactly what it sounds like. All the data folks are on the same team. They're on the data team.
And once again, like your miles may vary. This is arguing for the sake of arguing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so on maybe I'll start first with
yeah,
my customer, the platform slash centralized team at a high level. So it does depend on kind of what your goals are but what I would say in defense of this is that it's like long-term more sustainable and provides more business efficiencies because you can promote and proliferate similar or the same technology patterns and efficiencies across different use cases. So if I'm like leading a centralized data team, I can leverage the same technology, maybe like my Snowflake data warehouse and my Airflow orchestrator for supporting the product team and the marketing team and the operations team, rather than, the downside risk of an embedded team kind of maybe selecting different technologies. And obviously, you can still select the same technologies with an
I
embedded
was
team.
gonna
It's just
say like
harder.
that's
More
not
comfort.
something that could be. You could
Yeah,
just still have some higher level architect or whatever decide you're gonna
for
all gonna.
sure. Yeah. If you have that, like it's more conversations and, it's a little bit more friction in the organization. So I think ultimately what I'm talking about is like efficiency to get to the same kind of endpoint. Also reporting lines are clear with data team, with a centralized team. You can set incentives for people and align them so that they're kind of achieving business goals in a similar way. So I'll stop there. There's a few more arguments, but yeah,
Yeah, mine
curious to hear
are. I
yours.
mean, the
Yeah.
argument I think for the embedded are sort of like in some ways the opposite of that, right? Which goes back to like you need to decide as an organization what makes sense for you. Like for me, the argument of embedded team is that they are going to be much more aware of the context that they're working on. Like the example I like using is let's say marketing these days has like so much data coming in, right? With Salesforce, HubSpot, Google Analytics, LinkedIn ads. And if you have a data engineer or an analyst who's familiar with that world, like they know what the schemas are, they know the fields, they know how they relate to one another. And by virtue of sitting, as part of marketing, they're able to react to that and just be much more productive, much quicker without needing, someone like a product manager explaining requirements and things taking a lot longer. Right. So they're able to, I think, just like serve business much better. I think there's like, I'll relate to that. There's just much more accountability because like if your boss at some level or you report into like head of marketing, like you're going to care about marketing first and foremost. You're like obviously going to sacrifice maybe like some standardization or quality or best practices, but
Yeah.
you're gonna be much more like business focused, which is, the benefit. Obviously it comes with costs, which is why we're having this debate, right? It's like the reason you have debates is because it's not like a single
Definitely. And I think a lot of this definitely boils down to how well you implement either strategy. So definitely the case I've heard against centralized platform teams is that they lose business focus and they're busy kind of building gadgets and tools and widgets that are maybe not useful for the specific teams that they're serving. But I would say like if there's strong leadership on the platform team and they're like really well connected with, let's say, the marketing team or the product team or whoever they're serving, then you kind of do have that business focus. And on top of that, you can kind of serve those needs using like a common platform and get, synergies and efficiencies across those. So that's like the best case scenario, I guess, but obviously it doesn't always play out that way.
I think part of it's also thinking of, we're all products of our experiences. So like an anti-pattern I saw, in prior roles was, you have one team generating a new type of event, right? Let's say you're generating a new type of event going to Kafka. Some other team, say, takes that data from Kafka, puts it onto S3. Some other team takes it from S3 and, runs Spark jobs on it to create new tables. Some other team loads it into Snowflake. Some other team uses dbt to transform it. Some other team, goes into Looker. Like I explicitly said some other team in practice, obviously some of that responsibilities are the same, but you can imagine why as if you carve up things too, maybe into like too many vertical slices, it just takes a very long time to do reasonably simple things. So I'm like just more biased to say if you could have one person do everything end to end, like they're just going to be able to do things much faster, right? You don't have this like, and I think most people will agree, right? It's like one team could do the work much more efficiently than as soon as you introduce two teams, because then you end up with this like cross-team coordination problem, right? They each have their
Yeah.
own priorities. Agile, we have like 2 week sprints. It's like one team says, oh, it's not in our backlog, so come back, in 2 weeks. And like I think that's like the curse for a lot of these like
Yeah.
multi-team efforts. And maybe
Yeah.
I've been bit by it, too many times in the past, which is why I'm like becoming more of this like embedded absolutist.
I actually have a similar experience as you, honestly. Because when you're embedded on the final team, your eyes on the prize and you're like, what is the shortest path to get to that value? Right. And when you have a platform team, often you're for a bunch of like human psychological reasons, you're like, oh, let me do step A and then step B and build it for like the long term. Like an effective platform team or centralized team should still be eye on the prize and be figuring out the shortest path. But the problem is like they tend to not do that because their incentives are different. They're like building kind of a platform, a
That's the
data
curse
platform
of
that serves
platform.
needs on like a different time scale, maybe. So it's like a short-term, long-term thing also.
I mean, all platform teams suffer from that, right? Like DevOps, people say a lot of that about DevOps. It's like, I'm going to do Kubernetes because it's cool and people talk about it versus focused on like what is actually important for the business. And I think you just need good discipline and good leadership and good product management to make the platform team work. So I agree with you, right? It's like if you have that, it's like I think you probably lead to a better global outcome, especially longer term. I think
Yeah.
the challenge is in the short term, or if you don't have great leadership, like they end up being much more focused on like their own, maybe like cool technologies or things they care about, rather than what maybe like the teams on the edges themselves would prioritize.
Yeah. I mean, probably what we would both, I would
Mm.
assume, kind of advocate for is like definitely initially start out with like more embedded focus, like clearly on business goals. And once you get, it's a judgment call when you think you'll get efficiencies and economies of scale from like having a more centralized like component to that. But basically, that's a good problem to have. Try to get to the point where that even matters.
Yeah, like one analogy, and this is inspired by a conversation I had with like an old coworker of mine who was, we're talking about like DevOps, like similar idea, like DevOps as a platform versus DevOps embedded. And like the take there, the analogy there was it's like you can imagine a platform teams as building an internal version of AWS for your customers, right? Just your customers tend to be other teams. And in that case, like they should decide whether they want to fund this team and how much they want to pay. Because like if they're not using anything you build out, right, the primitives, that means you're a completely useless team and they should be able to do it themselves. So I think it's like giving sort of these platform teams more accountability in this point that it's like you don't have like free budget, you don't have free reign. Like you need someone to validate that you're actually adding value. So I kind of arguably make the same case for data. But I don't know, like part of me's the hot take I have is that data engineering in general like will evolve to be only embedded. And like every engineer should just have data skills and they should know Snowflake and they should know SQL and they should do like this and that. And like you don't need to have like the skill set that's purely data oriented. Like it's for like a variety of reasons I listed earlier, right? It just makes a lot of sense for everyone to just be a data engineer, no matter what you're doing. Maybe it's
Interesting.
for
And in
AI.
some
Everyone's
ways,
data heavy. Everyone's an AI engineer. Everyone's a data engineer. Everyone's whatever.
I mean, in many ways, people already are data engineer. By the way, if people have comments or questions on this, please just
Yeah, let me check
reminder
my
if
LinkedIn.
leave any. I don't know if we have any, but everyone already is. I mean, software engineers are passing around data constantly. Like they are, everyone is a data engineer on some level, maybe not at the scale of like passing around billions of tables and billions of row tables and transforming them. But I saw a meme the other day of like software engineers who like don't necessarily have that data literacy. Like instead of writing a single SQL statement, they'll build 10 microservices.
Yeah.
So that's like the extreme
Well,
version, I guess. But everyone
that
would
itself
benefit.
could be a debate topic of like, is everyone a data engineer? And like, I could actually make the case that it's not, because I think part of the problem is like so many tools and frameworks abstract SQL away from you, right? With like ORMs and like a lot of these relational objects that people actually don't understand how to write SQL or what it means.
Oh yeah.
I'll give an example. Like for what we're building at Twing Data, we use Remix as like our framework, to do the UI and the API, and they come with Prisma, which is like a framework. And to do some of the queries I'm writing in like Remix, using their model would be like impossible. Like I'd
Yeah.
rather just like do straight up SQL and maybe basically like what do they call it? Like hydrate actual Prisma objects at the end of the day, their types, but the query is like all handwritten, handcrafted. So I don't know.
Yep. Go straight to the SQL, man. I don't know how many times
Oh,
I've told software engineers that that's the path to enlightenment. But
there's one comment that says we should fight. If it's fight, that's the one comment we got.
yeah, we don't promote physical violence here on data debates, but
But for everyone like listening, if you have comments, now's a good time to drop it in. I know we're a little bit out of time over time, but happy
yeah.
to
Any ideas for future debates, Dan? Like stuff that's on your mind or that you think people are talking about a lot and is kind of
everyone's
messed up?
favorite topic of like Snowflake versus
Snowflake versus Databricks. Yeah.
Databricks. Another one I've been thinking a lot about is it's like I guess the world of BI tools, right? Like is BI a commodity or is it not? Like how important is BI? And then another like topic I've been chatting with a few folk recently is the sort of competitive nature. Like I'm a fan of what Cube is doing, right? That sort of semantic layer, but they're competitive
Oh
to
yeah.
look because Looker wants to maintain the definitions. So you end up in this world where each, I guess, company or each party is very self-serving, which is obviously everyone's like, we're in the capitalist society, everyone wants to succeed. It
Self-interest.
leads
Yeah.
to this like global suboptimum. So I am curious how it plays out, right? Like what's actually going to happen here. And like who wins? Is there a winner? We can talk
Or
about
like what would we prefer, right? Because I mean the whole system incentivizes almost fragmentation and specialization.
but it sucks from a
Um,
practitioner standpoint, right? Like no one
it
wants
does. It does. Yeah. Um, cool. And then there's also the is DBT good or bad kind of debate that I've seen floating around. Like has it done more good than bad or more bad than good? But,
What do you think? I guess this no, we don't have time for that. What else are we talking about? DuckDB, the take of like is Mother Duck, or maybe I guess there's DuckDB,
is big data dead?
or not that one. It's more like is Mother Duck, the corporate entity, going to be successful or not? Or is it going to go because like, the argument against it is that SQLite is used everywhere, in every single app, basically on your but as a corporate entity, like I think just only open source. Like, is that the future of DuckDB, where it's useful as like a building block for other products, but it's not necessarily exists or
Yeah.
like a corporate entity?
Well, and there's a related debate to that about like open source companies in general, kind of like is the open source building a company on open source technology the zero interest rate thing, or is it like a
Well,
actual
let's go
system
like
thing?
Tabular, right? The Iceberg company, they got acquired by Databricks.
For sure. Yeah, plenty of counter examples there. So I don't think anyone can categorically say it's a bad idea, but there are some challenges with it for sure.
We live in exciting times, like with the
Yeah,
world of
for
data.
sure. Cool. So maybe we'll tee those up for future debates and sessions here.
Let me check LinkedIn one more time. And no, we're good. Well, cool. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And yeah, if you have feedback, either add it on here, email us, message us, whatever the case is.
Yeah, if there's any topics that you want covered in future conversations, or honestly, if anyone wants to like hop on to one of these and even participate, let us know. Happy
Yeah,
to
you can become a judge, maybe, like vote live.
a ref.
Yeah, ref. Cool. You can lift our hands up for the winner. Count the points.
All right.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Had a good time.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Yeah.